Everybody, looks like we are getting really close to quorum, so we will get started in just a second. Just so everyone here is aware, I finally got call recording working. So I'm recording this meeting, and we'll actually get it posted up onto the agenda after the meeting. Took me long enough to figure it out. Also, if you have not yet put yourself as an attendee on the agenda, please take a moment to do that. You can merge any last minute pull requests as we're going through the opening. All right, let's get started. Welcome, everybody. Happy November.
Hello.
We've got a pretty packed agenda, lots of good stuff to talk about today. But as we always do, let's start by doing a quick introductions, just so we can put names to faces. I did sort our attendee list, so we should be able to just walk down the order in the attendee list. So I'll start. Hey everybody, I'm Lee, and I will help lead this meeting.
So I guess this is my turn. This is Antoine Boyer. I work at Amazon and I represent AWS AppSync.
James or Jesse here? I don't think so. Can move on.
Okay, I'm Michael. I'm working with ChilliCream, and we are doing the .NET GraphQL implementation hot chocolate. And my brother is, as always, late, so we can skip Raphael.
Hi guys, I'm Bruno from GraphCMS.
Benji or Yvonne here?
Sorry. Yep. Hey everyone, it's Benji, working on the graphical team and GraphQL.
Hi, I'm Ivan, and I'm working on GraphQL.js and helping with some other projects.
Hi, my name is Erik. I'm from IBM, and I'm working on libGraphQL parser.
Hi, I'm Alan. I work with Erik as well as on another open source tool called OpenAPI to GraphQL.
Mike here yet? Not yet.
All right. Hi everyone, I'm Benedikt. I work on Lighthouse.
Hi, I'm Steven, and I work with Netflix.
Vince let me know that he was going to be late to the meeting. So he's not here yet.
Hi, I'm Sam Parsons, and I work with PayPal, Braintree.
Hi, I'm Evan. I work at Shopify.
And good morning. I'm Howard Lewis Ship. I work at Walmart. We do the closure server on Licinia.
Excellent.
Go ahead.
And I'm sorry, late. I'm Jesse, out of order from Apollo, working on Apollo server, and take my sweater off.
No worries. Welcome, Jesse. That's what happens when we start on time.
I am Trevor. I'm with Apollo as well.
Hey, welcome, Trevor.
I'm Ashi. I'm also with Apollo.
Welcome, Ashi.
Hey everyone, I didn't make it onto the list in time. I'm Robert with AWS.
Same
Hey,
here.
Rob.
I didn't make it on the list on time, but I'm Nicki and I work for AWS, specifically Amplify.
Great. Welcome all. Did we miss anybody else?
Hello. You go first, Greg.
Hello, I'm Greg. I work with Untitled.
Yeah, hi everybody. I'm Andy. I'm doing GraphQL Java and also working at Atlassian in Sydney. So good morning, everybody.
Great. Do we have everybody? For those of you who weren't on the list yet, please send a pull request just so we can have an accurate record of everyone that was here. It seems like we have a handful of people volunteering to help take notes. Bruno, Benji, Alan, and Steven, you guys all feeling comfortable hashing it out on that doc together?
Sure.
Yeah.
Love it. You guys are awesome. I feel like we used to have to beg and plead people to take notes, and our notes have been super high quality over the last few meetings, so super appreciate it. Okay, let's take a look at our agenda for the day and make sure that we're covering everything that you all want to talk about. So we're going to be talking about some upcoming meetings and a shift to the agenda format from me, talking about shifting from CLAs and copyrights, intermediate interfaces, an update from Mike if Mike shows up, custom scalars, GraphQL over HTTP, and non-breakable chains of circular references, and input unions. It's a lot of good stuff. Anything else anyone would like to have on the agenda today? All right, I'll take silence as ratification of this agenda. Okay, first agenda item is mine. So yesterday I went through and added a handful of new things. I added our next upcoming meetings for 2020. I added the January meeting and the February meeting. I also changed the format of these agenda documents a little bit. I added a link here. I don't have to go through that too in depth with you all today, but I went ahead and updated the December one to the new format as well. Really, what it does is it tries to capture, it takes this chunk that's the guidelines that's at the top of these agenda files and moves them in line into the attendees section and the agenda section. And I've updated those guidelines to include stuff that we keep saying that we want to add every meeting, and I've made it part of this document. So I've made it a little easier to mark that you're willing to take notes, because the asterisk is probably a bad idea in Markdown. We accidentally bolded the whole file a couple of times. Made sure that people include their country code, made sure an agenda that I actually have an example now in that agenda, and ask people for relevant links, which we've been getting better at. And then also to make sure that there's always a name for an owner on each agenda item. So I mostly went through this by myself yesterday. So if anybody has any suggestions on how to make this better, I'm definitely open to feedback and further improvements on this. Another thing that I did is I created a shared Google Calendar that anybody can add. So I added a link in the agenda. You can add it to your Google Calendar. I also posted it on all of the new agendas going forward, both in the Google Calendar format and in the iCal format if you don't use Google Calendar, but you use Outlook or anything else that accepts iCal. Hopefully this is a good way to make sure that people don't have to manually add this onto their calendar. I made sure that they have links back to the relevant agenda for each meeting and set them up as recurring, but as always, we kind of tweak the dates a month or so out. So I just wanted to make sure that there's an update on that. I know maybe 2 meetings ago, I talked about setting up some changes for the 2020 meetings. Any questions, thoughts? Cool.
Yeah, I wanted to ask like small question. There it said consider opening a new issue. Maybe like why it's optional. I think like it's always good to have issue attached to agenda items, and we can open issue on working group repo. So maybe just make it required instead of optional.
Good feedback. Yep. I can change that language for sure.
And also another thing we'll like discuss that I'm actually a offender in that sense because I added my agenda items today, but maybe it's also I don't know that you should try to add it like a couple of days before, or like try to not to add it last moment.
Yeah, that's a good point. I'll mention that in these agenda templates as well, that it's always the best practice to put things up onto the agenda a couple days in advance. But
one thing that I would like to mention is that I think it might be more useful to, in the attendees list, instead of the organization, to actually list projects or projects that people work with, since that is more relevant to GraphQL.
Do you mean mention both?
Yeah, maybe both. I think, yeah, it could be both, sure.
Okay, because I know a lot of people work on multiple projects, but yeah, the idea is that if there's one particular thing that is most identifying for you, so Yvonne usually mentions that he's on the GraphQL JS team, as opposed to mentioning a particular organization. I do the same. I mention that I'm representing GraphQL Foundation rather than Robinhood where I work. But I can certainly make that language more clear as well. That's a great point. Cool. Any other thoughts on this? I'm happy to take as offline discussion as well. But I wanted to give you guys all that update. Okay. The next thing on our agenda is Erik's. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi. I'm sorry to bring up this boring non-technical issue, but we want to contribute to libGraphQL parser, and which is the C++ parser for GraphQL. And it used to have a Facebook hosted CLA. So, and our legal team basically advised us that this was an issue and we couldn't contribute before that was resolved. So Lee just changed this, and he basically updated, first of all the copyrights in the project, which still said Facebook, and he basically removed the reference to the CLA. And I opened an issue about this in the repository of the working group. I just posted the link in the chat here. I actually went through all the repositories under the foundation and saw that another one, namely the data loader one, has the same issue. It basically also points to a Facebook hosted CLA. And so maybe we want to change that as well. And I was actually, now that the CLA is gone, I was actually now asked to see if there's a possibility to get a CLA back. And if so, if it could be hosted either by the GraphQL Foundation, or maybe there's even an easier way where we would just have like a CLA.txt or something and reference it from the contributing file. I'm not 100% sure what the best way to go is, but I wanted to bring this up to discuss.
Yeah, I'm glad that you did. This is something we've been talking about doing. I actually really liked the tool that Facebook had set up for this, where there's just a web form that you could punch in your name and it associated to your GitHub account. And like once you had sent one pull request up, it knew for sure that you were safe to continue doing that. That was really helpful. I don't know if the Linux Foundation has a tool that does this, but that's certainly something that we can ask about.
I can chime in on that.
Hey, Brian.
So hey Lee. Yes, so the Linux Foundation does have a tool called EasyCLA, which we're in the process of rolling out to a variety of different projects, and it does exactly this. One of the advantages of EasyCLA is that we can have two separate workflows, one for an individual contributor who's signing on their own behalf, but also a second one for a corporate contributor where there's an individual at the company who says, who signs the CLA on behalf of the company, and then adds contributors to a whitelist so that they're able to, so that it's clear that they're covered under the CLA on behalf of the company.
I think that's what the Facebook tool did as well. I think you also had the option to go individually or as a contributor from an organization. I mean, if it's possible to set that up, I think it would be great. It would definitely calm down some of my legal colleagues.
Absolutely. And we can also set up some calls here with your legal colleagues if necessary to talk through this. I mean, be happy to do that.
So we already checked the CLA text, and the text that was provided in the existing CLA from Facebook was fine. Like they agree with it, but they didn't like that it's hosted by Facebook, basically, because it implied somehow that contributions, would go to Facebook or something like that. I'm not a legal expert, I'm sorry. But maybe is there to do out of this where maybe we have a follow-up call, Brian, on this?
Sure.
Or?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Cool.
This is definitely it's a known process, and it's one that I think we can help with.
Cool. I'm happy to join on that as well if it's useful, or also happy to just hear whatever report comes back. I think there's another open question that we were asking but never fully solved when we were first setting the foundation up, is whether we needed a legal structure based around textual contributions to a specification document, or a legal structure around an open source technical body that hosts technical projects. My understanding is that the legal stature is different in both. The stuff that you set up in the CLA is different in both. Presumably everybody in this meeting has signed that, because it's a requirement to attend these working group sessions, is to sign that membership agreement. We should make sure that membership agreement covers everything that at least the IBM lawyers are concerned about. By the way, if there's anybody on the call who's thinking like, uh-oh, I wonder if my lawyers are also freaked out about similar kinds of things, reach out to me or to Brian, and we can also kind of set up a similar call. But I want to make sure that membership agreement, which is essentially the CLA, covers everything that we need it to do, and then we can set up easy CLA that makes sure that people make it through that membership agreement.
We can definitely do that. I mean, just so that everybody's clear, we're in the business of de-freaking out lawyers. So, I mean, these are common questions, and these are certainly conversations we're happy to have with your counsel.
Yeah, this is great. I have a small follow-up issue. I'm not sure if it's worth discussing in too much detail, but Lee, you actually filed an issue, and I'm going to post the link once more in the chat here, that in libGraphQL parser, because it's a statically typed thing, in C++, you have a namespace, and the namespace currently also mentions Facebook. And you brought up the question whether that should change. This change, of course, would be breaking to all clients using that code. And so I wondered if there's any opinions from anybody about this. I mean, maybe it's a little bit too specific for the project, and it's definitely something that could be handled by just, creating a new major version or something, and then.
Yeah, that's why I opened the issue there. I wanted to make sure that there's discussion. I kind of, based on our previous conversations, weaved through that project to just look for any references to Facebook to see which ones are reasonable and which ones needed to be replaced. And I saw the namespace one there and thought, like, it's probably fine. There's no concern about having that namespace there. It's a little bit weird. It's not a Facebook project anymore that the namespace is Facebook, but I didn't want to go breaking anybody who depended on that project. So I don't know, Eric, if you can sort of lead answering that question, since you've taken an interest in contributing there. I can also kind of drum up if there's anybody at Facebook who cares. But hopefully it's a relatively easy change or an easy fix if we make a major update. But
Yep.
like, what should the new namespace be? Should we just delete that? Anyway, we'll figure that out on that issue.
Yeah, I agree. And it's just, I just wanted also to bring it up. So if anybody has an opinion or forms an opinion in the next days, then obviously feel free to post comments to that issue. I think that's it from my side about all of this. I would be happy to have a follow-up with Brian, at least, maybe also with Lee.
Sounds great. Another action item for me out of this is I am going to comb through all of the other repos in our GitHub org and do the same thing that I did for libGraphQL parser. Just search for all references to Facebook and make sure that they're just topical. You know, they're explaining the history of the project rather than something legal or copyright based that's no longer accurate. Sorry, it took me forever to do that. It's probably something I should have done 6 months ago, but better late than never. And I'll make sure that everything is updated appropriately, especially for the projects that are more evergreen, that there's not like a lot of active maintenance, like data loaders, the prime example of that. Making sure that that's all updated should be worthwhile.
Cool.
Anybody else on the call have any questions, concerns about legal, copyright, CLA stuff? Cool. Okay. Is Mike on the call by chance?
Yes. I had a bit of a process getting through security here at the airport.
You're at the
I hopped on a
airport.
bit late. Yes, yeah. I figured I'd get here a little earlier so I could make the call after security. But yeah. Anyhow, you guys can hear me, I assume. I'm
Yeah,
hearing
you
a
sound
laugh
good.
finally. Okay, good. So I think I just want to touch base briefly on the whole interfaces, implementing interfaces. I'm now calling it intermediate interfaces because that's what it enables, and it's a little bit less of a mouthful. It's been merged into GraphQL.js. I talked with James briefly. I know that was an action item from a couple months ago that he had some concerns, but I think we no longer have any concerns there in particular. I got a blog post ready, and I actually saw that Andy published one that was similar, which is awesome. I wanted to just link that here. I didn't want to put too much pressure on Yvonne to get version 15 out. So I figured, I think it's pretty close to feature lock here. So maybe it's close to, I should just go ahead and publish it. I just wanted to give everyone here a last kind of chance to express concerns before, too many people's expectations change. So yeah, that's basically it. Any concerns?
So your blog post mentions version 15 of GraphQL.js. Yvonne, what's the release plan for that?
Yeah, so I release Alpha 0, and I want to release Alpha 1. We had some ideas to hit feature freeze. Last week, I always going to US and back, so I basically was totally blocked in development, but returned back, and I want to continue to start actual TypeScript conversion, and Mike and others want to help. And we actually freeze everything, so we saw all intermediate issue and everything in pipeline. So it's feature freeze, but we need to do TypeScript conversion as fast as possible and release 15.0.
Is the plan for TypeScript conversion to do that as part of 15 or as soon as 15 was out? I was just not 100% sure.
It's part of 15. So because we promised to have after 14.0.0, after we became stable, we promised to have stable releases, and so So like I thought it was wasteful to just have a release specific TypeScript conversion, because there was like things that we like deprecated and other stuff. So actually went ahead and did all the stuff that involve like deprecation, removing, and bunch of breaking changes. I released Alpha 0 so people can try and get feedback. As I think I released it like a couple of weeks ago. Actually, I think I released it after merging UPR. So UPR is actually like some people probably using it. I don't think like most of users switch to Alpha 0, but I asked like Apollo and other vendors to try it out to see if it's breaking something for them or not. So everybody right now, if somebody wants to try this intermediate interface, by the way, I like the new name. It's like really help to resolve confusion. So if anybody wants to try it, like they can get latest version from Alpha Attack, and like I need to do some preparation work, like mainly set up like linters and set up like building process, and then I would like gradually accept help from anybody who wants to help with TypeScript. And I think like we try to push it as fast as possible, because I understand it's partly blocking a release process for like future spec release like GraphQL 2020. Because it would be great to have everything merged and have like month or two for people to try it before we like make it official.
Yeah. Cool. So I guess I don't really particularly care when I publish the blog post. I just want to make sure I do it not too early. I don't really care. Maybe I'll just go ahead and do that.
Yeah.
The reason why I was asking is I wanted to make sure that when you do publish this, that people can actually check out GraphQL.js and play with this thing that you're talking about. So it makes sense as like a, you know, the GraphQL.js comes out and then this blog post comes out right alongside it. And they say like, hey, this new version of GraphQL.js was released. This is one of the big new features in it. Here's more information about it.
Yeah, that sounds good. I can hold off. I'll just hold off until we publish.
Yeah.
Like release it alongside 15.
Yeah, that could work. Or Yvonne, does it make sense to do that 15 release earlier and then do 16 with the TypeScript conversion? Or just as a way to get version 15 out sooner? Or do you think that that's still on a fairly tight time schedule to do the TypeScript conversion and get this out?
Actually, I don't know. Like one of the things we need to do breaking changes after New Year anyway, because we need to drop Node 8. It become extremely
in December, yeah.
To support. It become extremely painful to support like old Node versions, because like dev dependencies stop supporting it, so like we cannot do continuous integration. So so I think actually, yeah, you're probably right. I think like we can release 15 and we can like I still want to do release candidate and have like and like ask one more time everybody to try it locally, like Relay team, Apollo team, or other teams, and get feedback. Because I added like around 10 breaking changes. Most of them are small, nothing like major, like mostly corner cases or stuff that we wanted to deprecate anyway, and was explicitly marked here. But I think you're right. It's actually, if we will release new version in January, I think like it's a good target for TypeScript conversion, and we cannot block a bunch of things.
I agree. That's okay. I'm glad we got to talk about this because that seems like a much better plan. I definitely agree about the release candidate. That's a great way to make sure that the folks at the Relay team and the other Apollo team and everybody else that's using that as part of their like critical underlying basis is not going to have anything be broken. And then that's a great story for the version that would come out in January, to be both compliant with GraphQL 2020 and then also be the first TypeScript version of GraphQL.js. Exciting. Thanks for writing this blog post, Mike. This is awesome.
Oh yeah, great. I hopefully this puts the brakes on some of the kind of classical inheritance patterns that I know are going to probably emerge at some point in somebody's code base. So yeah.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that you got to hash out any remaining concerns with the Apollo tools folks as well. That's a really strong sign. It seems like the last action item, which is on me for this, is to do a final review of your spec text, which should be the only thing that's keeping this from going to RFC 3.
Great. Awesome.
All right. Well, we'll move on and let you get back to your airport adventure.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for joining from a crazy place. Okay, next on our agenda is from Evan.
Yeah, hi. So Andy and I have been working on an RFC for a couple of months now to basically allow you to attach a URL or a URI to custom scalar definitions, which can be used to hold a full specification of what that scalar actually conforms to, which is good because right now people are cramming that into the description field and it's not well suited to that purpose. But it also will serve as a key for tooling like GraphQL to be able to treat as kind of an opaque identifier of what additional features can I provide around the scalar. So if we consolidate the ecosystem around a particular date time scalar URL, then GraphQL can see that URL in the definition of some arbitrary schema and say, oh, I can treat this as a date time. This general idea seemed fairly popular when we discussed it a couple of months ago, so I don't expect too much pushback on the general approach, but definitely, like, now that we're speccing things out, very open to feedback on specifics. There's a few areas where I'm less confident in kind of the decisions we've made, mostly around the grammar changes themselves. We don't have a clear winner right now on what's the best grammar for actually putting the URL into the SDL schema definition. And also there's the question of how do we define what a URL is in the schema? Do we import the entire grammar from RFC 39686 into our grammar, which would be a huge chunk of extra patterns? Do we just reference out to the other RFC? Do we ignore the fact that it can be an URL and just say it's a string? Open to feedback and input on all of these points and anything else that people care to talk about.
This is exciting. If anybody else has feedback on this, I'm gonna shut up and let other people talk about this first.
Have you already decided how the introspection changes for that? I didn't see any types in the spec item so far.
Yeah, I thought I did. Maybe that didn't make it up into the thing that I linked, but the introspection's not as complicated because it's just adding a field to the scalar type. Yeah.
So basically it brings this field to any type.
Let me just pull up this spec.
Because the introspection doesn't make this distinction really between scalars and.
Right. Yeah, it is in the so if you go to the incomplete spec edits part of the RFC that's linked from the agenda, there it just adds a specification URI field to the type in introspection.
Mm-hmm.
Right. Then, like, in a way, that would be basically like extending the description, because that's basically what a specification is, a very long description.
Yeah, but this is a specific field, like would be a URI field that is just used as a link. So you could do machine interpretation, like you could match for the string and know that it's a URI, that it's a date time, for instance. So because you have description at the moment, but description is not easily parsable because there could be anything in it. So it should be a specific field, or what was the idea there even? Yeah, okay.
Maybe to give a little bit background on the two goals we wanted to achieve is like I started a discussion specifically around daytime a couple of months ago, and this was kind of combined with the idea of having a general way of specifying scalar implementations. So daytime is a great example, for example, is a great example for a scalar which kind of needs a detailed description, and it should also be parsable by tools or identifiable by tools that the scalar implements a specific things. So this is what the implementation URL serves for. It indicates that a specific scalar follows a spec, and then you can build tooling and everything you want around it. And this like I'm pretty happy how it turned out so far, to be honest, because it overall solved the problem of how do you extend scalars, where you just specify them, and then like the GraphQL Foundation or this GraphQL working group could specify another scalar for URL, for example, and put out the spec and say the recommended scalar name for this is maybe URL, and then every server is able to say, there's a URL scalar, and this actually implements the official URL pattern, but it doesn't have to. Like if you have a legacy system which implements URL in a slightly different way, well, then put up your own proprietary or like different spec, or maybe even leave the specification URL out of it if you don't care. So it offers a way of being consistent across the ecosystem, but nobody is forced into a breaking change or is forced into implementing data really in this specific way. You are like maybe encouraged, but you don't have to.
Mm-hmm.
I also want to note one thing is that it's like pretty basic feature attaching URL to a type, and as Mikhail said, in introspection you cannot distinguish between different types. I actually think it's not a problem, it's a feature. I actually like to be able to add URLs to specs on complex types. For example, we have like relay connection spec, and currently it's like describe a very complex way how to detect connection or not. And actually in couple tools in Voyager and inside the Faker, I actually do this detection, and it's involving like multiple steps. So I would prefer to just get like a connection, get a type, and check if it's have certain URL or not, instead of like matching its name when matching its like field and other things. So I don't see any like any reason to restrict it to Scala, just to attach like URLs to any type. If we do it as directive inside the SDL, it will be like applicable to any type.
A really interesting thing. Yeah, we hadn't considered that. I want to think about that more, but
like I think my initial reaction would be like the reason is to keep it focused. Like the question would be like, what is the URL of a type? Like what do you specify behind the type system, right? The problem with the scalar is there's nothing in the SDL which says what a scalar is. This is where the URL comes into play, but the type actually has a description inside the SDL. So it's an interesting idea.
Yeah, but the type and the scalar are actually no different in the introspection. So you also have on the scalar, you can have a description. In the introspection, it doesn't really matter. So if we add just a spec URL to the types, you are just be able to put to any type some kind of a specification document. I don't see the problem there. So it would bring us where we actually want to have a spec document for a scalar, and we can use it in a machine readable way. But we also get that on other types, because otherwise we would have to make a distinction between scalar types and types in the introspection. And I think everybody was in agreement last time that this was not that bad.
Yeah, worth noting that pretty much every field on the type in introspection is already limited to a particular subset of types. So like there's the fields field, which is only for objects and interfaces, and there's the enum values field, which is clearly only for enums and that sort of thing. So it doesn't, if we want to start making types more general, like it feels a bit weird to start with spec URI. That said, I do sort of understand the use case.
Yeah, but the underscore type, the actual type representation of the type, that's just an object type. And it has either fields, but they just can be nullable. But the type always has fields. You can select on them. So it's not a union. Even for scalar, it has this property.
Right. I'll speak to this a little bit. We could have made this a union, and actually thought about doing that. Nick Schrock talked me out of it. He said it would be way too confusing for the first thing that you encounter with introspection to be a union. And he convinced me just to make a much simpler flattened type. The trade-off on that is that there's language in the spec on each type. That's where it describes introspection, that it describes only the set of fields where you see what to expect. And then there's always the last bullet says all other fields must return null. So that was put in place to protect against exactly the kind of thing that we're talking about now, where if we added a field to any one of these types, we would not be in a position of trying to figure out how to interpret it for some other kind of type that we didn't anticipate. So in this case, I agree that it's the right thing to start small and not worry too much about like, what does it mean to have a specification for a union or for an object type or an interface, which otherwise already have pretty good specification rules, where scalars have very few. And so we can just only add this to the scalar for now. And then that last rule for all the other kinds of types will apply and will require it to be null.
Eva, I remember discussing with you the possibility of adding extensions to the introspection. So, which would also in a way solve this issue in a more general way. So you could, the basic idea is to be able to attach structured metadata to the introspection, not just as part of the description, but rather as a basically a map that is attached to any type. And one item or one entry in that map could be URL, and that would work for any type.
I think I'm actually reconsider my previous point. Actually, I think Lee and Andy is right. We should not add features required for other features that we didn't discuss, and RFC should be atomic. So if with clear defined problem, so yeah, I agree. Actually, was carried away. So if we're solving a problem for this RFC is daytime scour, and we found solution for daytime scour, when we should restrict ourselves to solving this problem, when we will have like extensions. We, as part of extensions, we can discuss allowing to specify URLs on types. One thing I want to note is that if possible, we can have in mind possibility to relax it afterwards. So like, I agree, initially it should be scholars, but if we, design it so it maybe in future it would be possible to edit types. It's like, it's not hard requirement, it's just a soft requirement. So I don't see anything like in current proposal that prevents it. So yeah, I agree. Let's start from scholars, see how it's will be adopted, and if we will need this mechanism for other proposals like extension inside introspection and other things.
And I think that the other Evan said is what type is actually the specification URL. Is it a string? And we say this field is an URL, but it's a string, or do we introduce a new scalar like a URI type? And I think from my point of view, we should use a string because it keeps the scalar set smaller and easier.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty convinced that also that we should use string for the introspection response. My bigger concern was the actual SDL grammar, because that isn't really, yeah, that feels a little underspecified if we just say it's a string. And that's not like polluting the GraphQL. The only thing it pollutes if we import a URL grammar into that is the GraphQL grammar itself, which is, yeah, I don't know how I feel about that.
I posted a comment on your RFC with some like detailed out feedback, but one idea for the SDL grammar is rather than adding this to the grammar itself is to use a directive. So in the same way that when we want to deprecate a field, we use the @deprecated directive to do that rather than something that's specific in the grammar. I think this is a small enough thing that it makes sense to use a directive instead. The nice thing about that is that when you read a scalar, you can see something that explicitly tells you like why you're seeing a URL here right now, which will be nice. It means that the grammar change won't be breaking, which should also make it easier to adopt this. And then really all we have to do is spec this as a well-known directive and come up with the rules for where you're allowed to place the directive, which we already have spec language that lets us do that.
Yeah, playing on that, I don't see any real reason why we would want to restrict the URL to just scalars. I think that adds additional rules that are not beneficial in any way. It would be easier to just allow it on any type.
That's usually counter to what we would advise. So I know this is counterintuitive, but it's almost always better to start with the smallest possible change or the most specific change, because if there is, you essentially want to optimize for option value. What I mean by that is you don't want to make a decision without knowing for sure that you're solving a specific problem, because we're almost always bad at predicting the future, and people will end up using something in a way that we didn't anticipate, or finding out that it actually makes it harder to solve the problem that you wanted to solve that pops up in the future. That's usually the reason why we want to start small and then expand outwards. So say like start with language that says you're only allowed to use this on scalars, and then if next month we realize like, oh, actually this would be incredibly valuable for unions, then we expand it to say that you can use it there as well, or maybe even expand it to all types if we find out that that's particularly useful. I think I would only support making this more broadly applicable if there was concrete use cases for why you would want to put this on types other than scalars. So far, the motivating use case has been very specific, that custom scalars don't have enough information to do anything, and this provides that piece of information.
I think where it could be good is things like connection with paging, where you basically describe that this is basically a connection type, and you don't have to do the matching that we do now, like looking if something ends with connection. So you could specify.
Like my initial reaction to is like, while this may be true, I would encourage us to stay focused on the use case we are trying to solve.
Yeah, but I kind of agree with, I think Benedikt said it,
right.
that it's not, we don't have to pay an additional cost for it. Actually, it would be cheaper not to have an additional rule on that spec field. And I think the benefits that we could get is actually quite nice. Like we could describe higher level types. Like the first case that came into my mind was basically the relay paging. And I would find that very cool, because then I don't have to, like, we are building a client generator at the moment, and now we are doing basically matching on names. Is it ending with connection? And I would find that useful for that case as well.
I definitely hear that. I do agree with Andy that it does make sense to keep this focused for now. I would love it. The reason why it makes me a little bit nervous is I want to make sure that we make sure that we have an order of starting with problems and then working towards a set of solutions to investigate that solve that particular problem, rather than finding a solution and then finding all of the potential problems we can solve with that solution. I found problems down the line of that approach. And it's really easy to look at, especially when we're looking at proposals like this that are designed to solve one particular problem, to go, oh, wow, look at all these other problems that we might be able to solve with it as well. I just want to be particularly careful as we dive into that. I'm not saying that it's a bad idea or that it won't work. It might actually be the case that this is the right thing for that, but I would love to have a sort of a separate discussion and a separate RFC that investigates how can we have tools better be able to identify things like the relay pagination model or other pagination models. And if that all arrives on exactly the same solution, then beautiful. And if it arrives on a different solution, then that might be better.
Would it be useful as part of this RFC to document some of these use cases like pagination that we're thinking of? And so then, if there are some that clearly fall within scope, then that's great. But also, it gives us a place to say, yes, we thought about this and we decided that this is out of scope for this particular feature.
Certainly.
Yeah. I think we started that with input types, so where we just put a raw RFC document together and then basically put everything in it, and then deciding later what is out of scope. So just to get all the things together.
Yeah, I mean, I can throw this idea into the alternatives and variations section. I don't think there's enough different directions we can take this to want to do the full RFC doc the way we're doing input unions, but I'm happy to be wrong as well.
I think that would be useful. It's certainly great to have like a single document that captures all of the sort of discussion over time. I think that was a good takeaway from the input unions work. And this is an awesome start for this RFC doc. It sets out the problems and a lot of the it's a good crystallization of a lot of our previous discussion around the datetime piece in particular. But I agree that it would be useful to say, like, here's things that are explicitly out of scope. Like, here's the stuff that's still kind of to be decided. Cool. Evan, anything else that you want help with at the moment for this one?
I don't think so. I was going to ask for a review of the spec edits because I'm not super familiar. Oh, yes, there is one other thing. That was it. Andy has kindly written a short version of what would be like the first spec to use this new feature, which would be like a datetime spec. And that needs to live somewhere, which should probably be separate from like this RFC, sort of technically. And separate from the GraphQL spec itself, but also I imagine would still live on graphql.org somewhere. So it would be good to find that a home.
Oh, this is going to be a really interesting discussion. That lines up really well with the GraphQL HTTP topic that I know Yvonne wants to talk about later. Okay, I have a couple thoughts on this. First, I totally agree. We need to have a space where the GraphQL org and tooling and website and everything can scale up to support more than just one spec, because it's clear that we're going to need more than just one. The other thought is not every spec needs to be a GraphQL Foundation official spec. In fact, part of what I really love about this particular proposal of the specification URL for scalars is that anyone could come up with whatever one that they want, and they can host it themselves, right? So that if you know, the Shopify API has its own very custom version of what datetime means, there can literally be, you know, api.shopify.com/specs/datetime, and that like details it out, and then that can be the thing that's the permanent URI. That's awesome. I think that's the real superpower behind this particular proposal. But if there is sort of consensus around like, hey, if you want to like use the same one that everyone else in the community uses, here's a place where we all kind of agree that this is the one right one, then we should certainly have a place to be able to put those things. I don't know what that looks like yet.
Just a quick extension of that thought. If we're going to have a place to host the specs, then I think that might also be a reasonable place to point to canonical implementations of these scalar extensions. So imagine if we had, let's say, 3 or 4 very common custom scalars, implementations of these custom scalars on both the server and the client for a given library is something that somebody's going to look for immediately. I doubt that most users of GraphQL are going to say, oh yeah, let me just click through to the spec and implement, you know, RFC 3986 myself. They're going to look for an existing solution. So how do folks here feel about having that as an additional set of information on that same page?
I had the same thought from it, and I think that would be a great idea, because then it's much easier if you're starting a new project with GraphQL to see how others implemented these scalars.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that matches really well to how we introduced the GraphQL spec itself, right? It came as a spec and a reference implementation. And we should probably follow that lead, where any sort of GraphQL Foundation official spec will have a really high bar for the quality of that and for including reference implementations.
Yeah, my main motivation in the short term is just to have something to link to in the actual GraphQL spec. We need something to link to as an example of a thing that you could link to with this new field.
Right.
To come back to the idea of, I think having like promoting a specific version of a scalar is kind of the decision to make. Like if we decide that we want to promote consistency around the ecosystem for a specific scalar to kind of ease adoption and limited surprises, I think this is a good reason to kind of publish a GraphQL.org scalar specification. Like this proposal we put up definitely allows you to come up with anything you want, but the other aspect is like, do we want to promote consistency? And then I think this is a good time to think about, okay, this a specific scalar should be implemented in a specific way, or we want to encourage implementation in a specific way. And then I think it's a good time to put it up on GraphQL.org. Like, I think that's that's how I think about it.
Just to clarify, so I think that would lift those scalars to a level that is really close to what the official built-in scalar types have. And the only difference being that they are opt-in. So if you don't want to have them, you are still allowed to do whatever you want with a scalar that is called datetime.
Which is good. It's like an onion specification. You can start with core and your complete GraphQL, and then you can add if you need them, those extra scalars, but you're not forced to do that. Now I think that feels quite of good. There are many specifications built like that.
Yeah, that's the critical important difference, because I think that was the nail in the coffin for the datetime specific proposal, when we realized, like, we started polling the community and we found out that there was like no good name for that scalar. People were using the word datetime to represent Unix timestamps and 3 or 4 different versions of the IETF version of datetime, and we were not in a position to say, if you have a type called datetime, here's how it should work, which is why this one is great. But like, yes, your point is exactly right, that this is, if we end up hosting those on GraphQL.org, then the intent would for those to be official. So like, the hope would be that if you do have datetime, that we really hope that you opt into this particular spec.
Speaking of official scalars, excuse me if this was mentioned in the RFC, but are we going to carve out a special URI for the existing official scalars?
The existing official scalars are and will continue to be in the GraphQL spec.
No, what I mean is, like, this specified by, will that simply not be a property anywhere in the scalar, or is that?
Yeah, I know what you mean. I kind of assume that they would just link back to the official GraphQL spec.
Okay, but you see what I'm saying? Like, if we had a namespace, or not a namespace, but like a prefix for, you know, GraphQL : and then string GraphQL : enum, that would kind of say, that gives us an opportunity to kind of include some of these things. If we ever want to expand that set of official scalars, we could also do that by that mechanism.
This is a good open question about what the built-in scalars, if they should have this or not. My opinion in the moment is that they probably should not have that. I would think that you'd want to reserve specified by for custom scalars. It's a little redundant to use those for the built-ins. And then one thing that might be worth calling out, maybe as a non-normative note in the spec text, is the fact that these are going to be treated as unique identifiers, opaque identifiers by clients. And an anti-pattern that we'll have to be careful of is if somebody writes up a spec that has like 2 or more scalars in it, and then says, oh yeah, you know, my datetime A is represented by this spec, and my datetime B is also represented by that same spec. And now clients can't differentiate between the two.
Great. Yeah, another thing I want to add in is that once you've published it, it shouldn't change. Because again, there's no versioning capacity there. My thought on the built-ins was actually that they would return the link to the actual core GraphQL specification, because that is where they're defined. And it does run into this issue you just raised of having multiple scalars defined in one spec. I don't feel strongly about that.
Yeah, like you could use the hash links for like the string section, but
yeah,
I don't know. I feel like it's probably best to just reserve this feature for custom scalars where you need the disambiguation. because I think it would be redundant because there's already spec text that says, if you have a type named string, this is how it needs to work. And it seems like not particularly additionally helpful to also say there's a specified field for it. I'm just thinking, like, if I was going to build a tool, that I would probably sniff for that specified by field. And if it exists, then I would want to do something. And if it didn't, then I'd want to, you know, just assume that they weren't custom.
Makes sense.
And by the way, links to the specification have not been stable in the past.
Yeah, I mean, you'd have to decide which link it would be. The draft is not stable, but the previous releases are stable. But the stability point is a really good one, and another great example of something that you would want to call out in a note in the spec text, that not only should these be proper URIs, but they should also be proper URIs to something where the content is not expected to change.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. To go back to your question of, you know, just in the spec text for this, like what would an example be? I think it's actually pretty reasonable to link to one of the IETF specs. Like this doesn't have to be a custom written spec. This could be a spec that already exists, especially for scalars, which are typically just describing how a string is being formatted. There's not a lot of GraphQL specific behavior all of the time. And so, you know, date time, maybe you want exceptions, or maybe you want like a GraphQL specific subset. But maybe an example is a URL type. I actually think we already talk about URLs as an example of a custom scalar. And that one you could just point to the.
Yeah, that's the other example that's already in the spec. Right now I have scalar datetime to do, and then scalar URL and the IETF.
Although just with the datetime example, you have pasted their examples, what's allowed and what's not allowed. And I think some of the not allowed examples are actually allowed by the RFC.
Yeah. Well,
RFC. So in that case, I would have actually written up document that explains that this is based on the RFC, but doesn't allow all of it. Otherwise, you will have people implementing the full RFC, and then, for instance, data is allowed, I think.
And that's why we're doing this in the first place, and you can speak to it more, but basically the IETF RFC for datetime includes and supports a really kind of enormous number of formatting options, which don't make sense for the kind of specification that GraphQL would want for a datetime scalar.
And yeah, in this case, actually, you're right. And in this case, we should have a specification document. There are other things, like if you're looking at floating point numbers, they are very exact specification documents where you could just point to a, I don't know, a double precision floating point implementation, and you point to the EEE specification document, and it would be sufficient. But in this case, I would actually write something up.
Yeah, that's exactly our intention. Like, you can point to official specification if it's sufficient, detailed enough, and not ambiguous, and then you can do it. If you feel the need, like in the case of datetime, you need to be a little bit more specific and clear up some details, then you need to write maybe a short specification. If you want to come up with a total own version of something, then you need to write a full specification. You can do all of this because it's just a link.
Yeah. Okay, I think we're all kind of in agreement on where we want to get to. As far as next steps, I don't know what works best, Lee, if you want Andy to take his datetime spec and turn it into like a separate RFC where we can figure out where it should live, or if it should continue to just be part of the general spec change for adding a URL to these scalars.
I mean, it should be a separate document, or that was, I think, what Lee also said, that we should think about where to put it, or?
Yeah, sorry, that was more a process question. It should definitely be a separate document. The question was whether it should be a separate document that comes out of this same RFC process, or whether it should kind of go through its own path.
It should definitely be its own thing. Yeah, I just, for the sake of the future of this particular proposal, I'd love for it to be fully isolated, even though it's motivated by the date time change. I think it's actually completely reasonable that people would pick up the RFC 3339 date time, because there's a bunch of existing tools out there that do that. That could be totally reasonable. So I wouldn't want to hold this up specifically because the motivating date, like subset of date time that we want to talk through isn't ready yet. And especially for stuff like URLs, like being able to link to say, this is exactly what I mean when I say this is URL, is already valuable in its own right. So I would like to keep them separated, and maybe we can kind of listen in to what we figure out with the GraphQL HTTP stuff, since that's next on our agenda. In terms of what we want to do for the spec. Yeah, go ahead.
Just need to clarify. I think the question was, where do we put the? I think it's clear that we have that these are separate things, like defining the date time and defining that. But where should we put those the specification documents for date time? Should it go in the spec repository for now? Should we have like RFCs, or where to start the work on the specification document for date time?
I see. Yeah, sorry for misunderstanding the question.
Yeah, I think it's fine to keep it in the spec repo for now, but part of the discussion around that RFC, probably at the next working group meeting, should be on kind of finding it a proper home.
Yes. My expectation is that if such a spec does become a like GraphQL Foundation official spec that we're going to host somewhere, that it would be its own repo. But the path it takes to get from here to there, we can kind of figure out along the way.
Could I ask a question about more complex types? So what I have in mind at the moment is file uploads, for example. Is this something that you've already dealt with? Because at the moment, there are various GraphQL servers that support file uploads, both by using multi-part form data or by uploading through JSON. And if you upload through JSON, you probably use like base64 encoding, whereas for multi-part form data, it's I think binary or something, I'm not sure. With obviously the MIME headers. So what are we thinking of in terms of here for things that might serialize in different ways when they're modeled in different MIME types or transports?
That question has come up somewhere else. There's an issue that Andy linked to me a while ago that I can't remember. It's not specifically related to this, because that's kind of an issue with how scalars are defined in general, and whether whether the transport serialization is related to the scalar serialization or not. So I'd kind of like to make that a separate topic of discussion at some point. But yeah.
Are we talking about the HTTP part now, or is this?
No, but it's a bit mixed up, I would say. I would put that as a separate discussion point for the next work group. Because about file upload, it's a huge topic if you dig into it.
It totally is. And I can see this being a useful step forward for that, because you could at least, I know that Facebook's API, for example, does have a type called file. That's an input used as for inputs, and their tools just understand if you see a type called file that you have to submit your mutation in a particular way. But at least you'd be able to like see a spec for it, or a spec URL as an opaque identifier, and then behave the right way. So it seems like one of the things that we'll need in that direction, but it might not be all of it. So I agree with Michael that one probably deserves a bigger dedicated discussion.
I just want to quickly comment on the language we're using here around opaque identifiers. I don't think that, I think the spec URL is going to be a unique identifier, but it's definitely not going to be opaque, right? Because you're going to, like a lot of, like a lot of tooling might like
It's
be
a really
comparing
good,
it to a known list or actual URLs.
really good point. What I mean when I say opaque, it should be both unique and opaque. It's not opaque to a human viewer. It should be opaque to tooling. So all the tooling knows is that this is a unique string that I can like, does this equal this, you know, does this match anything I've seen before? But it doesn't know the difference between HTTP whatever and just a string of base64 encoded blah. Like it doesn't need to know what it is. All it needs to know is like, I can match this. And if I spot a thing that I've known before, then I have pre-programmed rules for how to handle that thing. But a human would then look at that and go, ah, that's URL. I'm going to open it up, see a human readable document, and then write their software that describes by that. But the reason why I specifically want to kind of keep using the word opaque is there's an alternate proposal to this, which we've talked about many times over the years and is always kind of not gone anywhere because it's really, really hard, is having a machine readable version of this that actually outlines a set of rules, and then clients would implement a generic way to handle scalars.
Totally, like the serialization format kind of thing.
Yeah, you could imagine like, oh, it has to match this regular expression or something like that. That's very much not opaque. And those are like, they have constraints such that they just always end up being a disappointment, which is, I think, why we ended up bailing on those directions in terms of a opaque URL identifier. But that's the reason why I'm using that term. But really good point to bring it up, because I do think when we end up writing the spec text that it'll be a important nuance to explain of how we expect clients to handle that piece of information.
Yep.
Cool. Let's move on to our next topic. Ivan, on to you.
Yeah, hi. So like, I have some problems with internet. So if you have problem hearing me or anything, just post in chat and I will try to reconnect to another Wi-Fi point. So about GraphQL over HTTP, we discussed it like a couple of times. A year ago and a year and a half ago, and like motivation, because as we learned like previously, like for proposal you need the motivation and to stay focused on this motivation. So my personal motivation for doing this work was that in our co-working space there is a company and they implemented their own GraphQL server. And like they liked the idea and they was really enthusiastic about GraphQL, but when they had some problems and I tried to troubleshoot for them, I have a trouble connecting to the GraphQL server using graphical like Altair, like with clients, because they implemented it differently. So they read the spec and they use GraphQL.NET library, which is like, as I understand, don't have any connection to HTTP. So it's the same type of library as GraphQL.js. So there's pure execution, validation, and other functions. And they implement their own like transport layer. And because they didn't use the proper name for fields, they just call it like, I think like variables was called differently. And like operation name, some arguments was called differently. For response, everything was better because spec actually describe names for field and responses. Describe should be data, errors and extensions. I actually like the idea that spec under specified transport layer, but at the same time, I think we need to specify how HTTP servers work. And with particular example, I gave it like on one side of a spectrum, it's like when people totally implemented like from totally reinvented transport layer. In most cases, people actually like do it. But at the same time, there is some difference in different implementation. This is this was motivation for this spec, to have mostly interoperability between different tools. So to make it more like plug and play, because I know like graphical team have constant problem with people asking them to add more configuration options to specify like URLs or headers or stuff. So I actually want to reduce number of configuration for connecting to GraphQL endpoint, not increase it. So idea about current state, it's like minimum valuable spec. It describes something, but at the same time, it's not prevent like experimentation, and it's not like touching. It's just touching common things. Like basically, what's most of implementation copied stuff from Express GraphQL, like reference server for GraphQL, and so I basically put it in spec text what's currently there. And idea like I can't. This project kind of stuck. But I like spoke with actually a person pinged me on Twitter and asked what is the status, and to be real, like I have a bunch of projects to work on, and like we spec already in minimum valuable state, so we can do something. So idea is here is to move it to foundation and to create like working group and have like people who actually implement servers to lead, like Apollo guys, AWS guys, and Rob Zhu actually commented on issue. So idea is like not about technical side of specification, but about process of moving it to foundation. Is it possible? How to do that? If people are interested in collaboration, and how we set up a like subgroup about that, and if there is any volunteers for participating.
I think it's a great idea to finally put that in an official spec. I mean, there's for a long time now this I would say specification draft, and it's kind of ubiquitous because every GraphQL server actually implements this minimal set of specification there, and it's basically taking what everybody's using to make it more official. And if you think about people getting started with GraphQL, they read the spec and okay, the spec is transport agnostic, but the main transport format is HTTP. So having a specification there is very valuable, even though that we can use it on other transport formats. And I think Ivan's proposal there is like a minimal solution. I'm just missing that we have an extension field there as well, like in the response, and then it would be kind of perfect. It wouldn't be overbearing to implement it. You still have your space as an implementer to add things, but it would be a great minimal specification to get HTTP running. That's my point.
Yeah, I also interested in this, and I think I'm the one who tweeted Ivan about it. I think it's really valuable to remove conversation about, okay, how do we handle, what's the right way to handle response codes or things like that. Let's like articulate that in one place so that we can interact across different representations of that, whether that's in the JavaScript implementation or there's loads of different languages implementing GraphQL over HTTP. Let's try and make sure that there's a shared standard that people have, which is mostly already implemented, but it's not documented in detail in one place.
Yeah, I'm excited about this. We've been talking about it for a long time. It's time that we really push this to the right point. I think there's a lot of things that we need to get right. There's, tools need to be able to know just because there's a URL and this says GraphQL, is it complied to the spec or not? So you'll have to have some sort of way to identify that from a tooling point of view. We should make sure that it's actually handling all the cases that tools like the Apollo client tools, graphical need, that it's actually handling the cases that all the server implementations like Express GraphQL or GraphQL Java, the other servers that are supplying HTTP, JSON are captured here. Right now it's like a little, it's not, I think it could be more strict, you know, whether it's takes JSON or not in post bodies, et cetera. There's just a lot of stuff that could be crisper. And I would love to see a subcommittee boot up around this that can sort of come up with a whole game plan of this is what the spec for GraphQL HTTP should look like. Here are changes that we need to make to Express GraphQL to other frameworks so that they can be compliant with that spec. Here are changes we need to make to popular clients, including graphical, so that they can very easily work with that so that we're reaping the tooling benefits. And we can have like a big launch of this thing with all these tools supporting this thing. Happy to host that as part of the GraphQL Foundation. I think this is the clearly the most important subspec around GraphQL that we need to work around. The one thing I'll ask is to have some volunteers for someone who's going to kind of champion this whole sub effort, and then two, if there's like an initial set of people who are willing to sort of put in the work to make this thing shine, I'd love to assemble that group. And if there's anything that I can do to support, I want you all to let me know.
I would like in this area to have some clarity on where we're drawing the line as to what belongs in the GraphQL spec and what does not. For example, as Sam was talking about in the beginning there, HTTP status codes. Is this something that says, I mean, we've already have the everything should be 200, but there are cases that are, you know, it's still in Express and not in GraphQL yet, like potentially a 401, 401 not authenticated, or some 500 situations. Do these belong in the GraphQL spec, or are we trying to separate HTTP from the GraphQL spec?
It's a separate spec. It's a separate spec that describes the transport over HTTP.
Oh, okay.
Right.
Thank you very much.
I think, like my understanding, right, is GraphQL needs to continue to exist, transport agnostic, right? Like it's a perfectly valuable thing over PubSub, for example. But this is just codifying like a common use pattern.
Okay, no, that makes sense. So what you're saying, if I can paraphrase, GraphQL spec by itself is completely transport agnostic, but when we find that they're used commonly over other specific transports, let's spell out some things to be standardized there too.
Yeah, and I mean, we are actually also using GraphQL over gRPC. So it's not like a case that it's transport agnostic that will never happen. There are actually cases where it's very useful to have a different transport format.
Mm-hmm.
Yep, the database queries are another great example of leveraging transport agnosticism, where they can submit database queries, which are typically not done over HTTP. But HTTP is certainly the lion's share of how people are using GraphQL. And so sort of for the exact same reasons that we'll specify here, I think it's going to be super valuable to have, you know, not just create some consistency around services and allow tools to be built that can leverage those things, which that's certainly been the most annoying part of GraphQL tooling so far, is connecting it to everybody's servers. But really good points on, there's a number of things that Express GraphQL does that aren't represented in the spec so far. We should account for those. All the various topics that are sort of tangential to this, you mentioned authentication. That's a really important one to mention here. You know, the spec should at least say something about authentication, even if what it says is this is up to you. It should certainly be included, because that's something that tools will have to be able to handle.
Yeah, and also I think when we have that spec somewhere written up, it allows to explore also other things, like Benji said, file uploads, for instance. You could, if you have a spec repository which describes the official HTTP spec, then you can put RFCs there to explore other things, like how should we upload binary stuff if we want to do binary stuff. I mean, GraphQL is not the best solution for binary streams and stuff like that, but you could explore things like that, and we cannot do that now at the moment.
Totally true.
Is there just to add to so kind of like the name of GraphQL over HTTP? I know there's a part in the spec that deals with subscriptions and possible implementations. Is the goal of GraphQL over HTTP also to describe kind of like maybe the polling solution of the subscription part, or we're gonna keep that out?
It's a great open question. I don't know.
And I'll add to that, is the existence of a sub-spec reason enough to remove things like that from the main spec?
There is nothing like that in the spec. Sorry, Liz.
Sometimes we'll have non-normative notes that will give an example if sort of this like specification text itself, especially in cases where we are intentionally permissive because we don't want the spec to limit what people can do, then sometimes it's really hard to interpret that. So like if we left the spec only at being explanatory of rules, then when you would encounter the section that says, you know, nothing about transport, you're like, whoa, but wait, like how do I actually run my send it to? So we need to have some non-normative explanation about how to handle those things. Subscriptions is probably one of the best examples of that because subscriptions are complicated and doing real-time connections is complicated. And so there is a fair amount of explanation about how you might do that. Now, one thing that we might want to change once we get GraphQL HTTP spec in a really solid state where we trust it and we would happily recommend people adopt it, is in the main GraphQL spec where we do talk about HTTP, we can specifically reference and link to that spec.
I'd like to be part of the group.
Yeah, same here. I would also like to join.
Willing to champion that.
Yeah, me too.
If that's possible too.
I think Me Too's are not going to be as efficient as we want them to. I think maybe there should be some sort of sign up form or sheet.
Yvonne, in his little the like kind of draft of this has like a file that I don't know if we want to use that his thing as a starting point, but he does have a list of interested developers in there.
I mean, the document that Ivan has there is a good starting point because it basically describes a minimal set that most of the GraphQL servers implement anyway. So you can start from there, and as Lee said, it could be rewritten, made more crisper, but I think it's a good starting point to use. And
so my proposal on what to do next is to, if it's possible, to move it under GraphQL organization, still mark it as a draft, your current working draft, how it's marked right now, and like what, and I can organize like a call similar to what graphical team have or with current working group, and I can take responsibility of trying to invite everybody who like implement the server, have a public API, or like can have interest in that. And I think like this can be a good starting point for a group. As I mentioned, the issue, I actually want this spec to be ruled by community, and because like we need to delegate more stuff. So, but I think like I'm okay with organizing with call and gathering all the people, and when we decide what to do next. So I don't think we need to plan on this call, like to measure point, like should we move repo into GraphQL, GraphQL organization on GitHub, and like just pick up like a date for the call, I think, and this would be starting point.
I mean, I think a separate repo for the HTTP spec would be great, or on the foundation.
Yeah, actually,
Or how did you think about doing that?
Yeah, actually thought like in future we can add like tests for GraphQL or HTTP specification, because it's pretty easy to test. You don't even need to specify API per se. You can just send query with __ type name in it. So it's pretty easy to write a set of tests. Even if these tests are pretty basic, it still would be useful to have them. So plus, I think like we can have RFCs for other stuff, like query batching or others. So I actually think it makes sense to have it as separate repo, because it's like a spec that we expect to be evolving. For example, for datetime, if you accept it, it would be more or less one-time spec. So we just wrote it and put it there, and hopefully it's not changing. But GraphQL or HTTP, it's like we're discussing streaming, subscription, defer, and other stuff, and it can be part of the spec, it can be evolved. So I'm totally for making it separate repo.
Yeah.
Okay, here's what I'll suggest for moving forward. There's one action item for Yvonne to schedule a meeting where anyone who's interested can hash out a further plan or start to take action on things that need to happen. I'm also going to strongly encourage using GitHub issues, because it'll let us just start moving on this and at least open up a bunch of issues for the things that we want as open questions, whether those are specific to the spec themselves or it's just about how we want to manage the effort and progress going forward. Let's use Yvonne's existing repo, and as a separate action item, I will investigate what it means to pull that repo into the GraphQL Foundation GitHub org, and if there's any prerequisites we need to handle before doing that. But that way we can kind of keep all the history of this project so far, and we have an existing place where there's already some good introductory spec text written. Sound like a plan?
Great.
Yes, sounds good.
Beautiful. Super excited about this.
Quick question to Ivan. Given that the next step is to organize this meeting, how will people discover when that meeting will take place?
Yeah, so like if we move in this repo, so I just create issue in this repo, and I will like ping everybody on this working group, and I will ping everybody from every company that have public GraphQL API, like major one, like GitHub and other. I think they would be interested, because like in the end they need to comply to spec if we make it official. So I'm taking this as an action item. I will ping everybody on this working group, and I will try to ping everybody who can be interested. And like when I create an issue with a date, I can actually create it like right now, issue discussing a date for a meeting, because I have like access to the repo, and I can create issues. So and you can, I will create it, yeah, and post in the chat, and you can send it to anybody you think can be interested in this, and we can discuss like a date and time that works more or less work for everybody.
Sounds great. Okay, let's move on. Benedikt, the next one is yours.
All right. So yeah, this one has been discussed in the last working group meeting. So it's about a spec change that clarifies a particular edge case that might happen, where you might render parts of your schema unusable. It happens when you define a circular reference to an input object on itself and make it nullable. So because there's no such thing as references in GraphQL, it's impossible to provide a valid value for such a type. So all that spec change really does is point out that fact and basically disallow defining such schemas. And what we decided upon last working group meeting is that we want to examine the complexity of those implementations. But I would like to add that because this is just clarifying one aspect of the spec, that the implementations don't really have to implement anything to follow that. They only have to validate, they are optionally, they can validate against it, but it's not mandatory for them to do it. So there have been 2 implementations that have implemented such a validation. It's the reference implementation in JavaScript and the PHP implementation. So as a objective measurement of the complexity, I looked at the lines of code in those implementations. So for the implementation part itself, it's 50 lines in the JavaScript implementation and 104 lines in PHP. The tests are 114 lines in JavaScript and 138 in PHP. And the validation function, which actually does the validation, has a cyclomatic complexity of 6, and it's called in exactly 1 place.
Benedikt, can you include links to the files that you're referencing that have when you're doing like line counts and stuff? I think people will just be interested to read that
Sure.
PHP and JavaScript code.
Sure, I will link the PRs that that make the change. Sure. Ivan, do you want to chime in? Because you initially implemented it in GraphQL.js.
Yeah, so like we actually have a cycle detection in a couple of other places. So it's not something that implementers need to implement for the first time. We detect cycles inside the fragments. And so like implementation costs are pretty small. It's mostly like we add a little bit of cost in a spec, so we added like couple of normative lines in a spec. So basically, it's like I think like cost in a spec is bigger than cost in implementation, but even in a spec, it's pretty small. So it's like couple of lines of text. And
yeah, it's like 51 lines in the spec itself.
Like we have 120 pages. Once I actually printed the GraphQL spec as a prop for my talk to show people how it looks like, and it's 120 pages. So currently, like, cost for this feature is pretty small. And I also want to say that I think like elimination of cycles is always good. Like even though we have like cycles in GraphQL, inherently cycles in GraphQL like for output types, I think like it would be great to eliminate them for input types. And since last time we agree that actually, I think it was action item on you to add like a note into spec that GraphQL is not intended to accept circular input values. So since we decided it's not something like we need to handle, I think like it's a good way to restrict it. Plus, with change we actually clarify this confusion, because as we learned like last times, it's totally reasonable to assume that GraphQL can support like in current text, but it was not intention, and like we decided against it.
Yeah, I still need to look into that. One question that I have is, Benedikt, you mentioned that this is optional, that implementers aren't forced to add this, but if that's the case, why bother? I mean, the spec is here to tell us what is and isn't allowed. And so I feel like this should either just not be in the spec at all, or it should be there and it should be a requirement that, that, you know, if you have this cycle in an input type, that your spec is now invalid, or your schema is now invalid.
What I mean by optional is that existing implementations that do not implement such a validation rule that protects against this change, they won't stop working as a result of this spec change.
Oh, I see. You mean that it's backwards compatible? Yeah,
totally. And it would be totally fine for an implementation to not ever implement this validation rule, but that would be just one less static validation guarantee that they are able to offer to users.
But the expectation is that they would, right? Like if so, sure. I mean, the reason why I'm asking this is, you know, right now we don't have a compliance test suite, but it's something that we've talked about building in the past. And if we did, and this was a rule in the spec, then we would certainly have a test case that defined a cyclic input object and then expected a validation error or a schema validation error.
Yeah, that makes sense. For that case, that would have to be included, sure.
Cool. I just wanted to make sure that I understood your intent.
I think like it's optional in the sense that it's not changing anything, so older implementation are still valid. Definitely, like when we added to spec, it's, I mean, like it's not a breaking change. And
right, it's clarifying something that would, right now, it's not a schema invalidation. Instead, it's just something that's impossible to actually provide at runtime. So even if you did this, you'd end up in a state where your GraphQL server just wouldn't really work correctly, at least for that particular input object.
It's basically advertising that you don't test.
Yeah,
and it's only possible to do that if you are not going over HTTP, or because if you're going over HTTP, cyclical input type is impossible.
Well, only with JSON. There's other serialization formats where.
Yeah. But in general, it's more about. I mean, in 90% of the servers, it wouldn't be a breaking change. That's what I mean.
Yeah, I'm okay with this because I think there are some potential weird edge cases where maybe you have some kind of input that you want to have, you know, references and you know, force them, and you are using a transport like mechanism that supports references. But I think the assumption has always been that this would be invalid. So like clarifying that in this spec, I think it's fine now. And if someone finds a use case later, I don't think it would be breaking anything to remake this possible in some weird edge case.
Yeah, thinking about the change from last month, I found that there are two basic assumptions that that underlie this rule. And one is that I think GraphQL schemas must be queryable. So they are meant to be used for querying and should function for such. And GraphQL is not meant to be a language to express a type system and offer introspection capabilities for that. Because if you were to take just that use case, then such a type would be kind of valid. And the second assumption is that I think GraphQL literals are first class, meaning that GraphQL operations must be able to be expressed by using just literal GraphQL query language. So features that work only when variables are involved that are not valid.
I really like that last point. I think that's a great way to capture it. Cool. This is useful. Do you need any additional input, or is there any other action that you wanted from this particular agenda, or is this just an update?
I think from this is done from the implementation side. I think the spec text is at a pretty good point, but if you want to have a final look at it, I think now would be a good time to do that.
Okay. Cool. Action on me to do a final review of your spec text. And if all looks good, we can tentatively move this to stage 3, unless is anybody against moving this particular proposal ahead to the next stage? Silence is golden. Okay, cool.
Like, I actually suggest just in case, like, James last time opposed it, so like, maybe have explicit confirmation. I don't think James on the call at the moment.
He's not here right now. I think he does still have some hesitations about it, but I'm gonna share the issue with him.
Yeah, just, you know, not to be agreement by because James is not on the call. So maybe like it's a good idea to pin him inside an issue.
Totally. Thank you for remembering that. Jesse, do you remember what concerns James had, or should we just wait for him to chime in?
I don't. I was trying to message him about it right now, and he's currently sick, so I don't expect him to figure out what it is right now.
Okay. Sorry to hear that.
It can be solved offline, so just ping him inside an issue. If there is still unresolved stuff, we can discuss it.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's no need to rush on this. I'll take this as an offline task to both do another review of the spec text and we can try to run down any remaining issues. If all looks good, we'll move this to the next stage offline. If there's any other remaining issues, we might wait for another meeting to discuss it again.
Sounds great.
Sounds good. Thank you. Thanks everybody.
Thank you.
Okay, next agenda item. Vince, this one is yours.
All right. Hello, everybody. I put a few notes in the notes already, pointing to some of the action that's happened in the last month. One nice thing is that all the historical issues regarding input unions, polymorphic input types, etc., have been closed with a reference to the RFC document. So that's awesome. We have added a criteria section that has a handful of points being made in it for what the shape of the solution should look like. We talked about that last time. And there's also an open PR to add a couple more solution criterias. There's an open PR, which I think is very interesting, to add a prior art section, which kind of references other languages or kind of IDLs or whatever that have a similar concept. So we can get a better sense of like the broader ecosystem and what is happening there. So that's cool. There's been a good amount of action. And this RFC document is getting closer and closer to feature complete. I think what further work would be continuing to get the solution criteria added in and registering what we've been calling the objections to them, which sort of just point out like potential incompatibilities or problems with a certain criteria for the solution. So that's kind of an overview of what's been going on. Lots happening. Open questions kind of still remain around what we would do once we had all of these solution criteria in place and all the objections registered. How would we take steps towards the decision-making phase of this whole process? But I guess I would want to open it up to discussions around that. Like, do people feel like the solution criteria are reaching near completion, or is there still a lot more work to happen there, or are we getting to the point where we can start talking about how to reach a consensus decision on this broad issue?
I actually want to add a couple more criteria. I had because of this GraphQL summit, I think I'm and some other people travel back and forth and prepare their talks. So I kind of fell off, with RFC process. I will try to catch up next week. And one thing I want to point is that working on this RFC actually helps us to think on a problem more. For example, it helped me to understand I need to finish with prior art PR because there is some suggestion to add a couple more links. I will add them. But when I work on it, I read the Wikipedia article, and for example, I discovered that in some modern languages like Swift and Rust and others, there is a new type which is pretty similar to what Benji suggested. And my biggest objection previously was to what Benji suggested with one field was economics, and that it was surprising. But seeing how other languages have enum types, which is basically the same as one field. So idea is not this particular point, but idea is that working on a document can help us actually to change our own minds on some of proposals. So I become more open to, for example, to Benji's solution, but because previously I just was opposing to it. So so I think criteria would be like that. If nothing added into document for a long time, and we ping everybody who participated in this discussion saying it's last call for addition, and nobody adds anything, we think document is complete and we go to the next stage deciding what to do next. But I believe we can even get closer to consensus during working on this document.
Yeah, I agree. And I also find the prior art kind of type of thinking really super valuable, looking at what exists elsewhere in languages and specs.
I love the prior art thing, especially if this isn't always possible, but sometimes you can also go all the way back to the source of where the ideas came from. So it's not just that this feature exists in this IDL, but you can find something roughly equivalent to our working group process that showed the introduction of such the idea, which is almost always helpful. I remember when working on JavaScript, there was a lot of that, of like pointing back to Python and to C# and to a bunch of other languages whenever we're talking about adding some language feature. And that was almost always illuminating for how syntax should work, how, you know, if people were particularly worried about some restriction or edge case, finding out that another language just shipped it without worrying about that, then you could like go talk to that language's user base and find out if that's a real problem for them or not. So it gives you like a parallel reality to jump into, which is pretty awesome. Especially for the IDLs, there's a handful of them out there that may or may not have something like this and have their own set of restrictions, and you can just kind of go poll those communities to find out what they like or don't like about those particular restrictions. That part's great. In terms of how we will move to decision-making process, my hope is that this document essentially becomes the decision-making process. It's a way that it takes what in the past has just mostly been one-off issues or us sort of debating through this in these meetings, and it captures it all, and it captures it in a structured way. And that's awesome, in that it keeps us from repeating ourselves and regressing a bunch. And so that alone is particularly valuable. But it also lets us sort of like hash through, like if we can agree on the problem and we can agree on the solution criteria, then it should follow that the only remaining possible solutions are ones that we all agree could work, and it's just a matter of you know, reducing them down to the one that's best. So my sense is that can kind of continue to evolve this document until some of the alternatives start to fall away as clearly not meeting the solution criteria. Yeah. And as we continue to expand the solution criteria, will continue to fall away.
So maybe we can invent some kind of way of like marking a particular solution as like fallen off or stricken from consideration. I guess that we would need to maybe classify our criterias as like critical, required, or optional, or something like that.
Yeah, we might have to be careful around ascribing subjective value to which criteria are more important than others, or which ones sort of like knock something out, because people are liable to disagree. But that's actually a valuable thing if people disagree, right? That's the kind of thing that we want to capture. So I think probably what I would suggest is just simply listing out for each possible solution, like here's how they rank against the solution criteria. So if the solution criteria is, you know, right now it's kind of just like a list of a handful of things that they need to be able to do. We can say like, all right, checks 3 out of 5 boxes. Like here's the 2 that it doesn't check, and here's why it doesn't. And my sense is that almost all of these are going to be behind on one of them. So we'll eventually kind of whittle this down to like which criteria are we willing to give up to let one of the solutions pass. But it'll at least frame it in a mind of where we all sort of agree that we're trying to figure out which of these criteria are more important, rather than trying to agree on which particular solution we like best.
Interesting. So you're saying like center around the criteria, not necessarily the solutions. Like we're evaluating the criterias.
I think that's right, because I think most of the debate in the past has mostly been people talking past each other because we don't totally agree on the problem and the solution criteria. Mm-hmm. And you know, if one person's favored solution totally misses the solution criteria, they're not stupid. It's not that they didn't see that. It's that they didn't think that solution criteria was particularly important, that's the one that they would cut in order for having a simpler solution, which is great. Like that, as language and software designers, that is how we should be thinking. But when we're doing that, it ends up being explicit about the solution and implicit about the criteria. And I find that for discussion, that's just been kind of really difficult. And it's been much more valuable. Like this document has dramatically aided the process because now we're sort of pointing at the criteria and we're coming up with objections and concerns about the solution criteria rather than objections and concerns around particular solutions, which is like way more crisp.
I think what needs to happen next is that we actually match up each criteria against each of the proposed solutions and do that meticulously.
I think we should actually hold off on that for a little bit, make sure that we've got all of the criteria in there. Certainly, Ivan's already said that he needs to add some more stuff. There's still open pull requests.
This can be a living document. Sorry to interrupt. I just want to, like, I don't want us to slow down on it. I want us to add stuff, even if it's partial, because I really want people to feel like this isn't something that requires a lot of discussion before we make changes to this document. This document is the discussion. And it's totally fine if people show up late with additional stuff.
Makes sense. I think an action item would be to figure out some formatting in the document such that we can consistently like note or these the way that we evaluate the criteria based on the solution.
Yeah.
A little thinking around that.
I also suspect that it's not going to always be pass-fail for some of the criteria. I think there's going to be a bunch of caveats. So having a way of like putting asterisk 37, you know, to reference a note later, I think might be important.
Totally. One thing that I've seen work decently well is using the like traffic light style, you know, red, yellow, green, where green means that it totally meets the criteria. It looks great. Red means that it clearly fails the criteria. And yellow means like, kind of somewhere in the middle. Here's some explanatory text of like why this is kind of bending the rules of the criteria. That might work, but I think it's totally fine if this doc ends up being kind of overly verbose. But yes, Vince, if there's ways of formatting this that you think can help capture that extra detail, that would be really useful.
Yeah, I think we'll have to come up with some like shorthand way, maybe a number or a letter to identify a particular criteria, and then let each solution have a little bullet point or a table with its how it stacks up to all the criteria. Perhaps.
Oh, I like that. I like that idea. Yeah, maybe like numbers for the solution criteria and letters for the solutions, or vice versa, or some shorthand for referring to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that could be pretty useful. That way it's clear that there's like a list. Here's the list of the solution criteria and it's enumerated, and here's the list of the puzzle solutions and they're enumerated. And if you don't see one that you think could fit, then you know we can add solution 30 or 40 or criteria Q or Z or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Cool.
Actually, like, want to suggest one thing that can speed up stuff. I feel like for some things we kind of lose the pace because PRs are not much into spec, and it's partly my responsibility because I have commit rights, but I like behind. I have like after returning back to Ukraine, I have pipeline of stuff I need to review. So can we have a rule? One of the reasons why I not merging stuff in timely fashion, and I think it's the same stuff for Lee, is that you need to read through all the comments to know that everything is resolved. So can I suggest, like, if Wins approve PR for RFC, it's like, imagine it's just a technical thing. Because right now I'm like, for example, I added Benja created RFC with more solution criteria, and to know if it's ready to merge or not, I need to read it. So I think like, can we have like like review process? So if it's green from wins, I just merge it. Because I think last time we discussed that he is a champion, have carte blanche on this RFC document. Is it like sounds good for everybody?
Actually, I have a suggestion here. I'm curious to get thoughts on. What do people feel about opening dedicated Git repos for these kinds of RFCs? That way, the like maintainer management of this can be up to the champions. Because I think like the clear miss and slowdown here is that Vince is clearly championing this effort, but Vince doesn't have merge rights over the GraphQL spec. And this document lives in the GraphQL spec repo. And so like he's in a weird position where he's maintaining this file, and Yvonne, you're like having to handhold him through doing that, which is not great.
Yeah, I agree. So I totally agree. One issue.
Is there any GitHub feature for merge rights in a subset of files or folders?
Dude, I want that feature so badly. There is not. I've looked into it. I promise you.
Okay.
Well, I think there is one. It's actually like why to add something.
Is there?
I think code owners allows that.
Ooh. Okay.
Cool.
I'll investigate this again.
Unless code owners is just requiring review from a certain person, I may be mistaken.
I think actually
that's what I thought it was, but
I think like both works if we can like I think like you can require code owners to sign, so like we can add it in reverse. In any case, like even creating separate repo is good. One problem I see is like ledger integrated somehow into main repo, but keep a history or like into somewhere. So like I don't think we should ever like delete such repos, but at the same time, I don't think like having like 10 or 12 or 15 RFC repos is long-term solution.
I mean, to start, I could just use GitHub's review feature, and then whenever that happens, Vaughn, you can merge it.
Yeah, so like, yeah.
I think give me commit access, and I promise I'll never touch any other files.
Yeah, both work for me, like first and second. It's like, for me, so right now, biggest problem is I need to review stuff and see like every discussion. So it's both green line from you, like, giving you commit rights, both works.
Maybe we should just have one separate Git repo for like working draft of spec things that you can just give everybody commit access to.
We could certainly try that as well. The thing that I was thinking about is it's not even necessarily that the GraphQL Foundation org is the place where all these need to live, but a process that the JavaScript community has been using that I think actually has been working pretty well is that since anybody can come up with an RFC, they typically just do that on their own accounts. They set up a repo, and then that's the place where the spec text lives, any explanatory stuff lives, any supporting files lives, and then all issues relative to that specific RFC all can live in that one repo. And then there's just one file that just lists out all of the current RFCs. And so there are just links out to all these various repos. That's worked pretty well because it just lets people set these things up ad hoc. They don't need permission from anyone to do that other than just putting the link in place. If that's something that people are interested in, or Vince specifically, if you think that's a reasonable way to do this,
I mean, maybe for the future, but like I actually kind of tried that. I created a repo in issues and just nobody knows who I am and nobody knows my GitHub handle. So it's just some random shit on the internet. Whereas being in the GraphQL working group, like that's really official.
Yeah,
but
that's
what Lee said is that we put a document in the spec repo with all the RFCs listed. And I think that's actually then you have like the pointer to your workspace. And I think that sounds fairly reasonable.
In addition to that, perhaps a convention of just forking the GraphQL spec repo and putting the RFC into the RFC's directory, for example, then that could solve what I think Ivan was mentioning as far as like it's it's useful to preserve the history of the RFC, and so then it can eventually just get merged in once it's there's less churn once it's been accepted.
I actually have another idea. What about like GitHub Action? So, and making champion like for RFC official. So it can be like we can project for somebody to write action, or we can borrow it from, I think like some other projects may have this. Like in PR, I saw it in TypeScript community when people who have like some rights, they can make commands to a bot, make comments with commands like match or something, or run a test. So GitHub have action, and it's actions they're enabled on GraphQL organization, so we can start using them and have like a bot that automatically match stuff that is approved by champion.
I see. Using GitHub Actions as a way to build the feature that we wish GitHub has.
I think it's idea behind the GitHub Action to do such stuff.
I mean, it's not bad to use that. Oh,
clever.
All right. Well, we have a handful of ideas here. Let's do the stupidest thing that works for the immediate future, just to unblock. I think the stupidest thing that works is, Vince, I'm going to add you as a maintainer to this repo, and we'll just have a good trust relationship that you're not going to go like mess with stuff or delete stuff or do something crazy.
Yep, I won't touch any other files.
Cool. And obviously that doesn't solve the actual long-term problem of how we'll do this for future RFCs, but sounds like we have a lot of good ideas on things we could do. I like the actions idea. Maybe we could try something with setting up individual repos for some of these more in-depth RFCs that can live in the GitHub, in the GraphQL GitHub org. If we're worried about that becoming sort of a polluted space over time, we can do, I know Facebook has this thing called Facebook Archived, where it's just another GitHub org, and they just move things there when they're sort of like no longer maintained or they've served their purpose. The recycling bin of the GitHub world.
Actually, another question about prior art. Like I know that input types was late addition to GraphQL spec, but still maybe you had some experience with such things in Facebook of requiring like complex types for inputs and some kind of discrimination between different forms and shapes.
That's a good question. I actually love Dan Schaefer to answer that one, because he was building something similar to that. I might reach out to him and ask him if he wants to wax poetic about that.
And actually another thing about all this specification, because I think like it's not working GraphQL working group, it's GraphQL specifications working group in a sense. We like half of the time discussing specification. I just remember that a year ago we decided to rename relay specification, remove relay from connection specification and from global ID specification and from mutation spec, just saying it's like separate spec for best practices. I think Alloy was the champion for that. So like maybe somebody wants to be another champion of this feature, just something to think for next working group.
Yeah, I'm happy to keep this working group just called the GraphQL working group. We tend to cover a lot of ground. We spend most of our time talking about the spec, but we talk about other things too. So yes. I kind of like to think of this as like a hub and spoke model, where this is our main working group and we spin off subcommittees and sub-working groups for more specific things that deserve dedicated discussion. The graphical one and the HTTP one could be good examples.
Also, just last question. You said specification 2020. Do we have a date for that?
Yes. We do not have a specific date, but I would love to do that either in December or January. Thinking based on the last handful of things that we have that are sort of stage 2 going on stage 3 or stage 3, that December might be tight and January might be more likely. But what I'd like to do is aim for December and promise January. But if anyone has any opinions on that, I'm open ears.
I think like we need to specify freeze period and like with actual date. So like just say for some period we don't accept anything and set up. I would vote for January just because I need to do a bunch of things on GraphQL.js. One of the things we want to merge is like directives, and for that we need to solve like with two-stage introspection things that I promised to do like 2 or 3 months ago, but still didn't have time to like solve. So I personally vote for January. It will give me a little bit more time to solve some working issues in GraphQL.js.
So basically, end of December's freeze, or would be your proposed freeze?
Yeah.
Yep, that sounds good. Also, my expectation isn't that the day we cut the spec that all of our main implementations are compliant. That would be ideal, but I don't think it's required for that to be the case. I think it's totally reasonable that we can cut that, and then there might be some lag time for implementers to fully get there. But we know in practice, most of the implementations closely track the draft. Cool. Sorry, Vince, going back to input unions, is there anything else that you need, or did we cover everything? Just want to make sure we got that closed.
Yeah, I think we're good for this time around. It seems like there's enough to fill the next month with the solution criteria and then a way to evaluate the criteria against the solutions. And then we pick up for how to make decisions next go around.
Beautiful. Cool. And then hopefully giving you access rights to that speeds you up a bit.
Yeah, cool.
Awesome. Okay, that was the last agenda. Anything else that we want to cover? Any other open questions?
I want to have a small announcement about GraphQL over HTTP. Actually, like I create a comment inside an issue. I think we can do it offline, and I actually choose the wrong date. So yeah, like I think we can solve it inside an issue. Just if you're interested in participating, please like subscribe to this issue, and we will discuss a date offline. And I didn't knew that November 20th is Thanksgiving, so yeah, I need to choose another date.
I feel like the date and time tool is pretty great, but the one feature that it's totally missing is to show you conflicting holidays. Cool. Anybody else have any last items or open questions?
Did we ever go over last meeting's action items and see if there was anything to carry over there?
We totally did not. Thank you for catching that. Better late than never. Let's take a look. Where did that go? I just tried to open the link. All right. Let's take a look at these. Actually, one thing that I'd like to do going forward is create GitHub issues for all of these. So it's great to have them in the notes, of course, but if we have them as GitHub issues, then we can actually use GitHub to assign them to people, track progress, right?
Yeah, I was going to ask actually, because there's probably a bunch from like 2 meetings ago and 3 meetings ago that are not done and have just been lost to time at this point.
Yeah, okay. Action item, meta action item for me is to go through all of the last handful of notes, and I'll transcribe these to GitHub issues. And hopefully going forward, whoever is taking notes or submitting the notes up as pull requests should feel free to have an extra step at the end of that to open up a bunch of issues that relate back. That would be super, super useful. But let's quickly go through all of these. So Lee was going to write up a draft plan for freeze and release. Just asked about that. Clearly I have not made that crisp enough. So that one is still open, but it sounds like January might be that plan. Adding a non-normative note to explain that variables can't be self-referential. That's a great candidate for opening an issue because that will require a pull request, which I haven't written. Moving Lexer look aheads to stage 3. That I believe we are good on. I had a conversation with Rob. We're good on that. That's going to move to stage 3. And this one was on Victor. Victor, any thoughts? I don't know if Victor is here actually. Grant website access to Tnay and Orta. I think I did that. Pretty sure I did that. Might have to double check. Give detailed feedback on website code changes. I have not done that. I had a conversation with Orta at the GraphQL Summit about this though, and I still owe that to him. Mike and Yvonne, this one sounds done, right? Alpha version of interfaces, implementing interfaces.
Yeah, I think it's done. So alpha version. So it's merged into alpha version and released as alpha version, so people can try it.
James was going to come up with concrete examples of his concerns. It sounds like Mike and James got to catch up about that and figure that one out. Mike was going to make sure that our test coverage for intermediate interfaces was up to par. That one looked good to you, Mike? Mike might be on an airplane now. That one I believe was good. And then input unit RFC document progress. We've made progress and we will continue to make progress. Cool. Thank you, Evan, for reminding me. Totally missed going back to that. All right. Anything else anybody has?
Yeah, I just wanted to recognize Ricky on the graphical team for just the awesome progress that he's making. He is just churning out code constantly. It's very impressive.
Hell yeah. Ricky is awesome. Huge props to Ricky especially, but you and Ricky for really doing a heroic effort lifting graphical out from cobwebs and a little rust around the edges to like a well-run machine. It's pretty awesome to see.
It's definitely mostly Ricky. I'm just trying to keep some of the issues away from him.
Thank you for doing that too. Cool. Anybody else have anything? All right. Silence is golden. With that, I'll leave the last half hour scheduled for all of you to take a nap or drink a beer or whatever it is that you do after this meeting. Thanks everybody for sticking with me. This has been a great one. We covered a lot of ground, and I will see you all in a month. Thanks all. Cheers.
Goodbye.
Thanks everyone. Goodbye.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye.